I warned Les that this would be a 1-minute introduction because every minute I take subtracts from the last 55 we've got with him before he leaves. But I do want to thank the service chiefs for bringing in the 7 cases that we consulted about. I want to thank 2 people who carry the ball around here for training, Bob Factor for shepherding up and down the hall and looking after the other room, and Jan Martinson behind the mirror who brings us to you down the hall on television, our master of the video apparatus who doesn't get enough credit. It seems a little silly to introduce someone to you that you just spent 3 days with already. It's a little bit backwards. It might even be counterproductive for me to introduce Les Haynes, because if I tell you how great and important I think he is, he'll just have to spend the next hour telling you it's not so. Prove it. You'll have to prove it's not so, right? So I won't say that. If I recited his curriculum vitae with the names of all these eastern places he trained in and taught, you just get prejudiced against him. Isn't it bad enough that he's a Harvard professor? I think so, from long experience. So I think this is our last hour here with Les as our visiting scholar. From now on, you'll be able to remember it as you pass in the hall here. We have his name will be down the hall. And hopefully that you'll remember something else as well when you pass this thing. So I think the best thing to do is not to introduce him, but to thank him for a magnificent set of consultations. Some might even say they've been thrilled by them, and remind you that he has just written a book called Making Contact. If you're upset about him leaving us, so you can at least prolong the visit by reading his book. And now I just would give... That's a commercial. Well, authors have to get them from other people. You're not allowed to do it for yourself. So, and now I just want to take this thing out of here and give him room to address us on the subject of talking with difficult patients. Les Haynes.
Jim is quite mistaken, and I'm fully capable of giving my own commercials. The first and best book I ever wrote is called Approaches to the Mind. And it can be secured for $8.95. And I think there's probably a postage charge from the Harvard University Press. And, in fact, most of what I've written since is really glossed on that effort. And the other book that Jim mentioned, which I'll refer to once in the course of this, is also published by the Harvard University Press, although that's more expensive. And I won't attempt to inveigle you into any such foolishness as spending $20 for a book of just 200 pages. You can do better than that. And I don't think you can get Jim's version. Jim's runs to about 300 or 400 pages, and it isn't nearly twice as much as this.
You pay for every page, though.
No. So, what I wanted to do today, I'll take my coat off. What I wanted to do today was to talk about interviewing. And in the course of thinking about this discussion, I've changed my mind as to what to do. But I'll introduce you to that in a moment. There are 3 things I'm going to do. First of all, I'm going to discuss some of the problems of interviewing. The very serious things that interfere with our securing reliable material and knowing what in God's name we are in fact doing. Second of all, I'm going to tell you what I'm not going to tell you. That is what I'm not going to have what I'm not going to discuss, what I had originally intended to discuss, which is really the content of this last book, Making Contact, which, as I say, you can secure from that and more readily than listening to me once again. And then in the third part of this, which will be about half of it, I think, I want to make some suggestions as to what interviewing might be like, how one might restructure our views of interviewing. And these are very preliminary ideas I have, but I hope that they will be of amuse you or perhaps even interest you as I present them. Now, the difficulties of the psychiatric interview as we perform it today, that is, as it's known in terms of the mental status examination, the history taking, categories, etc. The difficulties of this I don't think are well enough appreciated. It isn't only that people lie to us. It isn't only that we ask people to report on themselves, to testify in a sense against themselves, with all the difficulties that involves. It isn't only that we ask them questions, which means that they have to... Which means that they have to understand our question, ask it of themselves historically, then dredge out some answer from themselves, then translate into understandable language, then decide to hand it over to us. All that extraordinary neurological effort has to go into most of our even simpler inquiries. It isn't only these difficulties that I want to confront, but the difficulties that are endemic to the nature of mind itself. Now, I know it is not fashionable to talk about mind, but there are ways in which we cannot escape it. Not only that, our field is called mind science. That is, we were originally called mind doctors. As you know, that was their first name for psychiatrists. And the word psychiatrist refers to psyche, and psyche has a number of definitions, synonyms, the principal one of which is mind. So that the characteristics of mind are important to us as we attempt to round it up or secure representative specimens of it in the course of our investigations. Now let me remind you of some of the outstanding characteristics of mind. One of them is beautifully exemplified by your conduct in here today. As I look over your faces, I see some evidence of at least mild interest. Certainly there is a tendency not to look disgruntled or overtly bored. You maintain those attitudes of what should we say, mock concern, which one learns so early in the educational process. But having spent even more time in your situation as a listener than you have, I know that in fact, the only reason that you can stand to sit here as long as you have and listen to me for as long as you have is that in fact your minds are not present for the most part at all. The outstanding mental fact that makes education possible is the fact that you can send your mind away. You do that, of course, for many reasons. You do it to just think of more pleasurable things. You do it to solve problems which are important to your life, central to your life. You have learned, I'm sure by now, that unless you settle enough of your pressing human problems, you'll wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and you won't be able to sleep. So that the kind of ongoing, what's called worrying, but which in fact is the work of the mind, the ongoing mental concern is central to the maintenance of anything remotely approaching serenity. So that when you are listening to me, the great bulk of the time, probably upwards of 90 to 95% of the time, is spent actually elsewhere. Now this, of course, illustrates a remarkable property of mind which sharply separates it from the physical world, a point that I don't think physics has yet absorbed. The fact is that the mind moves faster than the speed of sound, that you can send yourself anywhere, anytime, instantly. And this, of course, is a source of enormous pleasure and also pain to the human species, because we're capable of inadvertently or on purpose bringing up the most awful subjects into our own attention and suffering for them. But it also means that we can escape. Just as you are now, for the most part, escaping from the bullying that I've been giving you for almost 3 days now. So this property of mind, to send itself away, to free itself up, is central to your personal health, central to the organization of your inner and outer lives. It isn't any hardship that you don't listen to me consistently. I mean, not only is it obviously a wise thing not to do, but it also constitutes something that's unnecessary to do, because as you've known from many years of education, if you check back in every 5 to 10 minutes, you will find that the person is saying essentially the same thing that they were saying before. And you can then go back to the serious matters that have been occupying you in the interim. I've had occasion to address the supposedly august Harvard faculty, which is far from august. But anyway, I've had occasion to address various elements of it over the years, and it's an extraordinary experience, because there the attention span is even smaller than in the nursery. Because because for various reasons. One is that the people you're talking to are immensely quick, so they figured out long before you began to speak what you were going to say. So it's almost completely unnecessary to pay any attention at all. And then there's a second reason, is that many of them, there are some of them actually, who have such important things to think about, really important things to think about, so the idea of their listening to you is ludicrous, if not destructive. So that if you take off your pants or fire a gun or do some interesting thing, you may get their attention a little longer, but the chances of sustained attention are so remote as to be astronomical. So this property of mind that sends itself away, I emphasize so much because it stands against the central message of medical training. Now, many of you have not had medical training, and that you're fortunate in this regard. Because when you complete medical training, what you tend to believe is that because the patient's body is in the room, that means that their mind is in the room. And that is a deep-seated delusion that is very hard for doctors to overcome. They have learned how to palpate, to manage, to control, to order, to invade the human body with such dexterity and success that the idea that they could have a person's body in the room and not even have the remotest connection with the mind is extraordinarily difficult for doctors to accept. And yet it's true, just as you are illustrating at this very moment. We also know that not only can the mind be sent away, the mind can also escape inadvertently. It can be what is called lost. And when you lose your mind, which is a devastating and frightening experience, when you lose your mind, you quite literally lose it. And this is not an expression of the hip culture. This is an account of the phenomenology of mind. When you lose your mind, you know you've lost it in precisely the same way you know you've lost your wallet. Because when you look for it, it isn't there. And if you've known, as I'm sure many of you have, people that are actually in the process of losing or have lost their minds, they don't find anything in there. They look in there and it's empty. And there's nothing in there that allows them to sort of take possession of themselves. And therefore you have all these extraordinary experiences of influence, of paralysis, of pathetic invasiveness, which constitute the famous Schneiderian symptoms to a very large extent. Furthermore, you know that you've lost your mind in the same way you know you've lost your wallet, because when you find your wallet, as hopefully you eventually do, you find it in an unexpected place. That's why you lost it, and that's why it's been lost, and you didn't know where to look for it. And that's precisely the way someone who's lost their mind finds their mind. It reappears in an unexpected place. For example, most notably in a hallucinatory experience, where suddenly your mind speaks to you from a corner of the room, or from the Gulf station, or from your foot, or any of the various places that mind shows up at. And then you don't recognize it is your mind at the moment, although chronically psychotic people will often tell you they do know that's what it is, even though they like to pretend that it's not theirs, particularly if it's saying something about that they don't want to hear. But so that the mind is lost quite as concretely, quite as definitively as is your wallet. There's another property of mind I want to call your attention to, because it may be in many ways the most devastating of all these properties in terms of the problem of the psychiatric interview, or the problem of talking to people at all. It's bad enough that the person to whom you may be speaking may not be there for all practical purposes. That has a devastating effect on the reliability of your findings, needless to say. But there's another way in which the mind confuses our efforts at understanding. And that is a property of mind not to be lost, not to be absent, but in fact to be invasive, to be so extraordinarily in touch with your mind that the patient knows more about what you want to hear and what you're thinking about them than you know yourself. Now this is not as rare a gift as you might think. Indeed, I'm sure a great deal of your mental happiness once again depends upon this property, figuring out what indeed it is people are up to, and figuring out in advance what they're going to do to you so you can offset it or in some way account for the dangers that are maybe present in such a relationship. I like to use as an illustration one of America's most extraordinary heroines, Marilyn Monroe, a tortured woman who, of course, caught the imagination of certainly male America for many years, still does, and also the imagination of some of our most gifted writers like Norman Mailer, who have puzzled and by her beauty, of course, but I don't think primarily by her beauty, but by the particular quality of her personality. Now, I'm not trying to say anything definitive about her here, except to mention one property of her mind, which was so extraordinary that it was over and over again mentioned, and that was her capacity to imaginatively reproduce the wishes of other people. It first came to my attention in a definite way when I was reading an account of one of her photographer's experience of photographing her. And this was a very experienced fashion film photographer who photographed many very well-known and exotic people. And he said that in photographing Monroe, he had never had an experience like this. And the experience specifically was this, that when he started out to take a picture of her, he found he had already taken the picture. In other words, it was not necessary for him to order her to take a position or to do anything, or even for him even to point the camera. That somehow she was so deeply tuned in to his fantasies about her that she carried it right on, acted it right out. And so he just sort of sat there like an automaton, this man described, clicking pictures of this woman's fantasy, of his fantasy of her. Now, what it takes to do that is, of course, an exceptional gift, although not as exceptional as it may seem in my experience. And it's reflected also in her account of herself. And as you know, she gave many poignant accounts of herself, not only because she was an actress who was interested in herself and had been trained as an actress, but also because, of course, she was one of our patients. Unfortunately, she was not a successful one of our patients in the long run, but she was one of our patients for a long time. And I'm sure that had part in increasing her self-consciousness. And what she said about herself was that she was a different person with everyone she met. And that this gave her a very disintegrated feeling of absence and uncenteredness, and was a source of considerable agony and displeasure to her. Now you could see how that is the other side of the other thing, because if someone is so deeply tuned into other people's fantasies and automatically, I'm sure there's an automatic process, although there were parts of it she was conscious of, I'm sure, but so automatically made her movements correspond to other people's wishes and fantasies, she was essentially a prisoner. She was essentially a puppet of people around her. Now, I don't need to expostulate at any length at all on the impact of that kind of person on the interviewing process, because it simply means that what we hear from the person is a reading not of the patient, but of our own imaginations. So it is as if we were looking into a mirror and seeing ourselves, rather than supposedly giving an account of a separate individual, because perhaps no separate individual is there to be seen, but only some kind of reflection of our own deeply understood and immediately perceived interest. Now this is a phenomenon that extends, as I suggest, deeply into mental life. There's another aspect of it that I will remind you of, because it concerns a better known psychopathological entity, catatonia. Catatonia is no longer a subject of great interest as it once was, but there are aspects of it that should always catch our eye. At the turn of the century, the means by which the working clinicians diagnosed automatic obedience in catatonia was by means of a test that is described in Boyler's textbook, in Kreplin's handbook, in Gasper's General Psychopathology. In other words, it was a very widely used procedure. When you are asked as clinicians to demonstrate automatic obedience, you probably use the more humane and familiar idea of lifting someone's limb and seeing if it remains in a certain position for how long, so-called surreal flexibilitatis. It's certainly a perfectly acceptable means. But the turn of the century was marked by a different device. And it is so beyond the contemporary consciousness that it may be hard for you to believe this was a routine procedure. That is, what is done, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, what was done was that the patient, the doctor would take a tongue blade and stick a pin through it, familiar device of neurologists for the detection of sensory loss, and would say to the patient, "Stick out your tongue." And then he would strike the tongue with a pin and count the number of times. He would successively say to the patient, "Stick out your tongue, take it on the tongue," and then he would say, "Put the tongue back," and then take it out again. So you'd have this command taking the pin, command to return the tongue to the mouth, out again. And it was a beautiful, well, medically ideal test because it's quantitative. And you can simply measure the number of the time the person is willing to undergo this very painful procedure. It will not, I suppose, surprise you once you've got past that particular horror to know that they also did it on the conjunctiva and sometimes on parts of the sexual organs. Because there was an interest in exploring how far you could go with it. I mean, how much obedience could you elicit? I sometimes like to tease the biologists of schizophrenia by asking them whether there is a lesion in the tongue extrusion nucleus that might explain this catatonic phenomenon. Of course it couldn't. That's a trick question, isn't it? Because it couldn't be the tongue extrusion nucleus because it also occurs in the conjunctiva or any other part of the body. Or is there an obedience center in the mesencephalon which has been in some way overstimulated? Well, I won't carry on that debate, but it's conceivable that there might be some brain lesion which rendered people so extraordinarily obedient. I think most of our responses to that finding, though, would rely in the direction of describing people who are terrified into obedience. And it isn't, you don't have to look far in the modern world to find equally blood-curdling instances, whether it's Eichmann at the Jerusalem trials describing what the guards in the concentration camps were prepared to do, or Stanley Milgram's experiments on volunteers torturing patients, to realize that all of us have in us a capacity for extraordinary obedience under certain conditions. Martin Orrin, my favorite hypnotist and greatest living student of hypnosis, at least in America, likes to say that if you can produce any phenomenon of obedience in hypnosis by simply putting an ad in the University of Pennsylvania Gazette or the local newspaper here and offering $5 to people to come in and be experimental subjects, he has been able to demonstrate that no phenomenon of obedience, stretching across boards, remembering your high school teacher, is not reproducible simply by getting willing subjects to help you in the experiment, quite apart from any hypnotic induction. So it's clear that one of the characteristics of mind that we perhaps all share in varying measure, I don't mean all to the extent of automatic obedience, of the catatonic sort, but we all share, is a capacity to render our minds essentially in the service of other people's wishes. So these things, and I could mention others, as I'm sure you could, these constitute characteristics of mind which render the production of reliable material about an individual's human life a formidable task indeed. Because if people are going to be able to detect what we really want to know, or are obedient to what they feel our commands are, or if their minds are far away or even lost, how indeed are we going to know what the products of the interview are likely to mean? So no wonder that many of our colleagues give up the whole study of mind and hope that by the dissection of brain mechanisms, determination of symptom clusters, the reactions to medication, they can put psychiatry on a less subjective basis. And of course, more power to them. I mean, they do what they can. But there are many of us, of course, who feel that we will never escape the heavily mind-centered nature of psychic work, and that therefore we better get busy and find other means to offset these features of mental life, which make so hazardous our concluding about anything we know about patients. That's the end of chapter 1. For those of you whose minds are tired, you can realize that you're more than 1/3 way through. Well, more than 1/3. Now, I was going to say at this point that there are some things one can do to increase your chances of getting reliable data. I was going to talk about empathic speech and counterprojective speech and performative speech and ways by which we guide the interview in such a way as perhaps to give it a better chance of locating someone, of offsetting invasiveness, of producing less self-denigrating, more reliably present people, etc. I was going to do that, but I've been doing it for the last 2 days, and I'm tired of it. So you are saved from that excursion. Furthermore, to return to my commercial, you can secure a better account of it than my talking today will be from reading a book called Making Contact, or articles that I've written over the years. If indeed you haven't figured out a better solution than I did to the various problem. So, end of chapter 2, mercifully short. So I'm now going to spend the rest of my time making some suggestions as to how one might think about interviewing in a general way, not in terms of specific moves, as Jim likes to say, in the interview of an empathic or counterprojective sort, but in one's general orientation to the interview situation. That's what I will hope to speak about. And like the good professor that I am, I'm going to use the blackboard. But since most things I'm going to put on the blackboard are more or less ludicrous, I thought that I would remind you the old Robert Benchley movie about the sex life of the newt, which probably your generation is not fortunate enough to have been exposed to as often as I was. But Robert Benchley was, of course, one of the great humorists of American history. May be revived and remembered unto the very end of the Great Republic. But one of his best skits, which was actually a movie, was about the sex life of the newt, an enormously uninteresting creature, out of which the indifference of the creature's sex life was, of course, the thing against which Benchley played in this skit. And it's funny, and one of the features of it was that in order to introduce his creature, the newt, to his breathless audience, he first drew a small picture of the newt, and then, fearing that there were people in the audience who might have missed some of the features of the newt, he drew a larger picture. So this was the level of edification that was being indicated, and I'm afraid you'll soon see that I'm not going to improve a great deal on that. These are Jim's insignia, which I've left. You see, everything's put in quotation. I suggest a provisional nature and wisely to the audience that's here. So my diagram is hardly more complex. This is an arrow, an ancient symbol of many things in the Western world. And let us pretend that this arrow represents an ongoing life, lived time and space, let us say, of a human being, someone that we are, for reason or other, interested in finding out about in our curious ways we are. And that we think of the patient now not as a sort of a blob like the newt that is plumped down before us, who has features that we will discern, but as someone whose life is going on still, whose mental life particularly is going on still, even though they're stationaried for a moment in our interview room. Because in fact that, of course, is what's going on. They are changing right before our eyes, even if we can't see it. So let us pretend that this is the patient, this arrow, this ongoingness, this thing that points from the past into the future, right? Somewhere in the present. Curious categories, aren't they familiar to us all? Vague, indefinite, but real. This body, this person, this world is our person. Now, in order to best, what should we say, take representative data, a useful specimen of this creature, a relatively undistorted portion, a reliable datum from this arrow, where should we best place ourselves? There are obviously three possibilities. Here in the front, here behind, famous position, and here beside, and then one more, right on top, like the horseman. Right? Those are positions that we could assume, couldn't we? Now, the position we generally assume is this one. In other words, we stop the person. We say, stop. Tell me about yourself, right? Don't change too much now. Tell me about yourself. And we sort of push them back. We don't want them to go on too fast past us. We want them to stay there while we look at them. And so we ask them questions which suspend the ongoingness of their life and hopefully sample some aspect of their self-dredging out. That's where we generally place ourselves. Now, there are disadvantages in that position, some of which I've mentioned, but let me mention a couple more. One is that we've stopped the person. Maybe we've stopped them cold, if we say cold, right? We've stopped them. So we're not seeing them, so to speak, freely in action, right? Furthermore, when we do that, we're sort of at their mercy. Notice how that arrow is pointed. We're at their mercy. And we're at their mercy, we begin to notice some really kind of disturbing things. For example, I've always been amused by the fact that when someone tells me that a patient is megalomaniac, and I ask them how the observer knows, they say, well, the patient told me they were. In other words, they stopped them and they said, are you such and such? And they said, yes, I'm a terribly grandiose person. And that's an interesting thing, because in my experience of human nature, megalomaniac people generally think they're modest. I mean, they generally feel that they usually quite appreciate how extraordinary they are. While modest people often feel megalomaniac, pretentious. And so that when someone says to me, I'm a terribly pretentious and entitled person, I suspect immediately that they're probably rather self-denigrating and modest. Huh? Because that reverse thing is a characteristic of human nature. So that there's all kinds of curious distortions you could introduce if you stop someone and then take too seriously or too literally what they tell you. And here there are many, many tricky places that those two examples of megalomania and modesty don't do more than begin to touch. Now, as you all know, great historic, still reverberating moment in the history of our craft. It is a craft. Perhaps it's not an art or a science yet. It's a craft. Someday maybe it'll be an art or a science, but now it's a craft. I think not quite so well developed as painting. Perhaps a little better developed than woodworking, although they tell me that that's a mistaken view. But in the course of the development of our craft, one of our greatest inventors, one of the men who did something like discovering the hammer on the screwdriver, suggested that instead of placing yourself in front and stopping this strain, you get behind and just listen to it. I don't need to remind you who that was. And so he tried to put it on a couch. And he stationed him back here and said, Al, go to it. Please come back Monday, Wednesday, Thursday at 4 o'clock. And I'll be still sitting here, and maybe if you give me all that stuff out of it, I'll find out something about you. An inspired idea. May not be as specifically directed as I think it is, but still it really is comparable to the hammer or the screwdriver or the saw, or one of those great instruments which have made such an extraordinary, or the wheel, which has made such an extraordinary difference in the history of our beleaguered species. So that's another place. Now the trouble with that position, as all of you know, whether you tried it or not, is that sometimes the arrows go right out of the room or won't come back. And I'm not selling it short, because it remains an excellent device. But I'm not going to waste more of your time thinking about that. But I want to discuss two other places you can stand. Here and here. And I don't even necessarily have to do what Harry Stack Sullivan said, which means we're better to sit beside the patient than in front of them or behind them. Never sit behind paranoid people. That's one of the great troubles with analysis. You sit behind paranoid people, they can really go even crazier. And that, of course, is one of the so-called transference neuropsychosis complications that has beleaguered psychoanalysis from the beginning and still. But he suggests you sit beside, you be an ally, be on the side of the patient. But what do you do when you're sitting beside them? You know, how do you direct the flow? Let's say you really say to yourself, I'm not gonna ask any questions. I'm not gonna try to get up front and push him around. So here I'm blowing my horn again. I have made some suggestions. It's not entirely my invention, but they have some specialness, I think. Maybe the way to sort of give some direction to the arrow, if in case it goes off in, quote, the wrong direction, or wastes too much of your time, or whatever, is maybe the way to direct it is to put different things out in front of it, which might shape its movement. So let's say the patient's been chattering on about his grandmother, ever. You're bored with the grandmother, and nothing new seems to be coming out. And you don't want to shake him. You don't want to say, I'm sick of your grandmother. about somebody else. You don't want to disturb the flow. You want to play into the spontaneity of the person. So I throw out there in front of me a different target. I say, I bet your grandfather got sick of hearing about the old lady or something. I put that out there. I do what I call making a mark. I make a mark out here. And for a minute, the head is the head. The head, wavers still toward the grandmother, and then sees this new target and begins to direct its attention there. And so I begin to hear something about the grandmother. Now, this is a wonderful device. I really mean it, because you can be just as general or just as specific as you want. For example, say for some godforsaken reason, I want to know whether the grandmother was fat, thin, short, or tall. Say that there is some reason to answer that question. And there often is in clinical work. So what do I say? I don't just mention the grandmother. I don't put it down there, but I say this. I say, your grandmother was terribly overweight. I say that. In other words, I put a fat grandmother out there for him to look at. And he looks at the fat grandmother and he says, oh, she wasn't. She was only about 83 pounds and 5'2½". And all of a sudden, I found out this information I need. In other words, I don't have to be right. In fact, it's better if you're wrong. If you're right, they say, oh, they stop and they wonder what's going on here. But if you say something really foolish, they say, well, he's just as stupid as I am. And they go on comfortably, exposing their world. Because remember, their world isn't just this arrow, it's the world of theirs. So you see what I mean by making marks. By being beside them, by putting things down here, you can take the whole history. You can find anything you want. And it's an interesting feature of human life that people have a much easier time correcting marks than they do remembering things. And that's just something you've all learned from examinations. If somebody comes in and says to you, on what day of the week did the Battle of Lepanto end? I mean, let's say you're a specialist in the history of Turkey. On what day did the Battle of Lepanto end? And the mere fact of asking a question erases the answer, right? You're embarrassed, oh my God, it was a Thursday. The whole thing is falling apart. But if they say to you, if the instructor says, the Battle of Lepanto ended on midday, Sunday morning, you say, of course it didn't. Because, the mind is encoded in such a way that it finds it much easier to not match something or match something than simply to dredge it up out of some place. So it's much easier to get things and more reliable things this way than by asking people these questions that we love to have. Well, I won't go on at great length about that because I've only got a few minutes left. But you can see how, with a little imagination, you can go on doing this. This is not my invention entirely, because of course the concept of projective tests does something very similar. By putting down Rorschach cards or thematic apperception cards, you do something similar. But this, of course, gives you even greater freedom in that, because you can put down anything you want, about anything. You're not restricted to the cards that Henry Murray discovered in the TAT or Hermann Rorschach in the Rorschach. So that's the way to go about it. And you say, well, I'll never get the whole history taken that way. And you'd be most surprised to find that you can do it very quickly. And in my experience, which may be quite prejudicial, much more reliably. Now, there's one more position I want to talk about. And this is the one that I left to last because, of course, out here in the West, we have cows on, bronco riders, and their feet Easterners who are afraid to stand up on top of a motor scooter, much less a wild beast. That this position should appeal most of all, of course, to you. What would it be like to write it? To be right there with the patient while the feelings buck up and down underneath you. Well, you can see immediately what I mean by that. And this is, of course, an affective position, because you can't sort of get on top of their mind, although sometimes you can read people's minds or complete what they're thinking. But for the most part, you're placing yourself with them in their experience. Not now standing outside to observe them, but to be with them in the flow of feeling. And you all know what this feels like. Sometimes you've had an interview with somebody where you felt the two of you were together, and where the whole thing just went on. And it's a thrilling kind of thing, powerfully revealing, comforting often to patients who are lonely. and wonderfully revealing of the true range of the affective life. I'm not going to belittle you either with the kinds of language or means by which you get with people, because in part they're idiosyncratic, individual. We all have our own ways of getting with different people. But that's a place that it offers strategic advantages of immense power. I'm not talking now about the overcoming of loneliness, the feeling of being understood. There's such powerful forces in human life in which you tap into by being there, but simply the management of the interview. So that when you're there, when you're with a person, you can do something that is a little bit like this, but also different. Because when you mention different aspects, you can often tap into them. The way of riding a horse, you can pull on the reins or kick up the stirrup or do something of that kind, which will bring out other elements of the ongoing flow. Because your strategic position allows you great access to those feelings. On the other hand, if you're up here and you say to the patient, "Oh, you're looking angry today," and you stop and you look back at the person, you know what that does to most of us. And inwardly we say, "Oh, you son of a bitch, get off my case," right? And depending upon the degree of your socialization and politeness, you say variants of that back to someone who proposes such an intrusion on your life. On the other hand, when the flow is ongoing, and you're saying things like "how awful" or "Jesus Christ," or you're doing the kind of exclamatory, empathic things that carry feeling forward, you don't have that interruption to people's feelings, and you're much more likely, I believe, to secure an authentic account of their existence. This position also allows you to draw feelings out that are hidden, disguised, forgotten. It also allows you one of the most terrifying of all our clinical rides. It's also some of the great excitement of our work when you do it, but it also can be very scary. For example, if you're with someone who is furious, murderously furious, and instead of trying to calm them down, divert them as you might this way, question them, interrogate them, you simply want to stay with them in their horror, their fury, their sadness, their desire to die or to murder, and simply not leave the local scene through it. You can have some of the most suspense-filled moments of your life, and often some of the most clinically productive in terms of helping people share feelings which unshared may be lethal. But as you go on in your clinical work, if you haven't already, these may be old things to you. And you'll find yourself, I think, more and more looking forward to interviews with difficult people. And here's a dividend. Looking forward to interviews with difficult people just because they test out your capacity to remain seated in tenuous or bucking clinical situations. And one of the things about our work, that sometimes discourages people is that it can become intellectual, it can become dull, it can become interrogatory, it can become district attorney-like, it can become judgmental, all things which have a place in our work, but can sometimes cause the loss of the kind of extraordinary excitement, the privilege of sharing a life that is, of course, it seems to me, at the very heart of the opportunity of our work. So this position has, at least in my opinion, a position of great interest. Finally, in closing, let me suggest this, that these two positions in particular, and this one to some extent is that, also allow us to break free, and here's my final point, to break free of the dependence on content, which is so characteristic of this position, and which is characteristic of a lot of our deliberation. In other words, we depend too much for our knowledge of the patient on what they tell us. And that's always a good thing to have. I'm not saying it isn't useful, but to depend entirely on it is to open us to the kind of confusion and mistakes which are characteristic of, for example, of thinking that someone is megalomaniac because they think they are, right? Or someone who says, "I'm too demanding," which usually means that the person may not be demanding enough. In any case, not only opposes us to the limitations of content as a way of knowing human life, but it also forces us to move from an exclusive attention to content to an interest in form. Because when we sit beside the arrow, rather than face up against it, we have the trajectory of the person's life to some extent passing before us. And now we can make judgments of things like vitality, movement, feeling, connectedness, self-correction. Does the arrow move when it diverts off? Does it move itself back, etc.? So that position to one side gives us, I think, a better chance to make judgments about this battle you've heard me going on about so much in these last 3 days, that is the determination of human health. And when you feel with your beside the arrow on it, when you feel the vibrancy of a life, the coherent fullness of a life, you know you've got a lot easier job than when you look at it and it's, you know, what do we say, dead in the water. As so many, of course, of our customers, unfortunately. So, these are my suggestions for reorienting the way we think about the interview, and I hope for improving the reliability and usefulness of some of the things we find out in the course of doing it. Thank you very much.
So we've got about
7.5 minutes.
Yeah, 7.5.
But of course, being free spirits, being arrows, pushing our way through life, we can just get up and push this which we've already happily done secretly with our mind.
Care to make any predictions where you think psychiatry will be in 20 years?
Well, it's, you know, Eve and I were talking about something like that. I think the other day or this morning. Make a joke, you know, where the patient's going to go. You usually say, well, they're going to be probably somewhat where they already are. And psychiatry will probably be largely where it is. I've watched it now for 35 years and it hasn't changed a great deal. It's much bigger. When I came into psychiatry, there were many medical schools that had no psychiatry department.
What about the teaching of psychiatry and the teaching of psychotherapy in particular?
Well, unless we're even more foolish than I fear we are, they will go on and prosper. Psychotherapy has grown enormously. Psychotherapy doesn't appear, I'm told, as a word in the Oxford English Dictionary. It only is dragged in by about 1904 into the use. And so it's a 20th century word. And today it is, of course, an industry of enormous proportions. We feel threatened by the fact that all these smart psychologists are going to steal our patients away from us, and the social workers and the nurse practitioners and God knows who else. But in fact, there's more than enough patients in most communities to go around if we want to do the work. And it is a great source of pride to me that psychiatry and medicine have always been great leaders in the development of psychotherapy and psychological work. And I don't need to mention Freud and Sullivan. Many medical figures have been central, and I think there's no reason to believe that will change. In fact, I think we can see in the coming generation, another generation now coming to bloom, people who are also making, have an extraordinary impact on the way this work is done. So I see no danger that it will go out of existence. For one thing, we can't afford to let it go out of existence, not only because it doesn't pay so badly, and because a lot of people who need this kind of leadership, but also because you can't run an inpatient service without a lot of experience in that work. I know that because I'm often called on the record to find people to run inpatient services. That's what I had a hand in for many years. And people that are trained simply in descriptive psychiatry or psychopharmacology simply cannot run an inpatient service. They just don't, they can't, because the disease designations of patients doesn't contain enough information to manage them. You have to understand their personalities in order to manage them. And that gets you right into the middle of the psychological fray, into the whole business of the understanding and management of character. And so we can't escape it. In other words, if we're going to be leaders of this field, and not just pharmacists, or computer specialists. I mean, we just have no choice whatsoever. And, but don't worry. I mean, it's, you know, as one of my wise neighbors used to tell me when I was complaining about my children, he said, this too will pass. It did, generally did. And when I came into the field, the analysts had come out of World War II and they were all over the place, buzzing, you know, bright-eyed, telling us what the real truth was. And it was a terrible time. Because so many of them were Viennese and they were arrogant. And they did something that the worst biological psychiatrists don't do. They would come up to you and they would look at you, and when you disagreed with them, they would say, well, you're sick. And that was just so awful. It demoralized a lot of people. And I mean, the biological psychiatrists will think you're stupid. It's much worse to be thought not only stupid, but sick. And that's what now. And we have that behind us, thank God. And, you know, and now we're in a descriptive period, but already it's clear that the limitations of that are being seen, and we hope that the descriptive thing helps even more, and we hope the biologists discover great things. When I came into psychiatry, we were without phenothiazine. And I'll tell you, that was a hard time. Up on the wards, we had to have the police and the fire department in at least once a month, because the patients would take the bed springs and the equipment, they'd pile it up in front of a corridor, and they'd get behind it, and you couldn't get at them. You couldn't get at them, and you had to have tear gas to get them out. So and that period, thank God, is over, because of phenothiazines, first medications that ever allowed us to have some control over behavior without producing organic syndrome. And sometimes the phenothiazines produce a lot of complications, but they don't do what the barbiturates do, what the bromides do, what even chloral hydrate and peralloy, which were great drugs. We used to hand them out in ladles. They were great drugs, but they still produce too much organicity for the degree of control. And phenothiazines helped a tremendous amount. And anybody who would practice in the serious cases without some measure of them is just nuttier than any patient will ever be. So there's a big thing, good things that have happened. And, so the field has grown enormously. It has gained a much more varied perspective on its work. And I think just it'll go on that way. And we're very fortunate because we have the most interesting work in the world. The clergymen hear great stories. They hear good stories we do. They generally don't listen long enough. Many of them don't. They start preaching at them. They don't hear some of the most inwardly interesting parts of it. They're often helpful, but they almost never get paid. The lawyers hear fascinating stories. People will tell lawyers things they won't tell us because a lot of people are much more concerned about their wealth than they are about their health. And so the lawyers hear very interesting stories. They get very well paid. But they don't, in my experience, they don't do very much about some of the important problems that they should. Although they sometimes help a lot. So we're in a unique position where we're still paid some, probably not as much as we'd like to be, but we're still paid some. We hear the greatest stories in the world. And stick with the cases. The acute cases you can do a lot with, of course. The less acute cases you can often help relatively rapidly. And even the worst cases, if you ride the Bronco long enough, you see that things happen that make you feel like if you drop dead now, you can go up to the good Lord and say, don't you hold it against me, fella. I was all right. I did something good. When I started out, I thought everybody's life got better and better, healthier and healthier, and wealthier and wealthier. I had to live in the neighborhood for a long time before I realized it was just the other way around. Most people are pretty well dead psychologically by the time they're 35. Because of that fact, I realized that psychotherapy has an endless place to bring back to life. And it's better than the internists, because the poor internists are going against solid tumor and arteriosclerosis. And even if you jump up and down 50 times a day and never look at salt or fat or anything interesting, you know, you're still probably going to drop dead from one of them. So the poor internists have really got an uphill battle. But with many of some of our most encapsulated chronic problems, you can see movement come and people can begin to like other people a little bit, you know, maybe even love their work, talk to their kids, for Christ's sake. Amazing things happen in the course of these things. And as I say, you go to your maker with a vague sense that you don't have to crack your head.
Les, you always say things that end right on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.